So I don't know if you know this, but back in the 1800s, tight-roping was a big thing. And probably the most famous tightroper was a guy named Jean-Francois Gravelet, also known as the Great Blondine. Now, I probably messed up both of those names, but he got really famous in the mid-1800s for being the first man to tightrope across Niagara Falls. And I love this story because as he's preparing for this, no one has ever seen this, right? No one's ever had the opportunity to witness such a daring feat. And it says, as legend goes, that on June 30th of 1859, he makes his plans known to all around, and some records say that 100,000 people showed up to watch him dare this great feat. Now, I don't know if that's how many, but sounds good, right? I mean, at least for sure, 25 to 30,000 people probably showed up, which you think in the mid-1800s, that was a journey to go watch this feat. But as he gets up and he's preparing for this, it's a little bit windy. You can imagine the falls just roaring. And he gets up and he's addressing the crowd and he says, hey, who believes that I can make this happen? Who believes that I can cross Niagara Falls on this tightrope? So some, of course, are like, well, yeah, we believe. You know, we've seen some of your other stunts. We believe. Others, I can imagine, are just like, hey, pass some popcorn over here. We're going to watch this guy fall. Right? Maybe they're taking bets. They're like, hey, 3-1 if this guy goes down. But they wait in anticipation. It's an 1,100-foot expanse. And as he begins to make his trek across with the falls 160 feet below him, he crosses with no problem. You can imagine the crowd is getting a little bit more excited now. They're really like, oh man, that was well worth the trip to watch him cross Niagara Falls. They're abuzz. Right? They just witnessed this impossible feat, what they thought was impossible, and this guy said, no, I can do it. So on his way back, he crawls out to the crowd on the other side as he gets over. He says, hey, I'm going to cross back over. Who thinks I can do it blindfolded? Well, now they're probably a little bit more like, oh, well, we saw you do it unblindfolded. Yeah, we believe you can do it. We believe you can do it. You've got this. And so he crosses, no problem. And he gets to the other side and he says, the crowd's cheering. They're just ecstatic at this point in time. And he gets to this other side. He's like, I'm gonna go over again. Who thinks I can cross this tightrope pushing a wheelbarrow? Now they're like, oh yeah, you got this. If you can do it blindfolded, you can do it with a wheelbarrow. And mind you, it's not probably one of these fancy, nice new wheelbarrows that's like has bearings on it. It's probably this like wobbly, mid-1800s wheelbarrow. But he picks up his wheelbarrow and he crosses to the other side, no problem. And they're like, yes, man, this is such a great show for us. Like, isn't that nice? Like, this is the entertainment of the day. Like, this was really getting them going. And so he gets to this other side. He's like, all right, well, I have to get back. Who thinks I can cross this falls with a wheelbarrow? And they're like, oh, yeah, we believe you can do that. We just saw you do it. Easy. He's like, but with a man in it. And they're like, yeah, you can do it. I'm like, if you can do it with a wheelbarrow, surely you can put a person in it and cross. So he said, okay, who wants to ride in the wheelbarrow? And the crowd goes silent. No one offers. It's just crickets. So he's like, anyone? Hello? Anyone want to ride in the wheelbarrow? See, no one in this crowd of tens of thousands of fans who moments before were just shouting, we believe you can do it, offered to get into the wheelbarrow. And here we see that belief is a lot more than just stirred up emotions in our lives, right? Belief it's a lot more than just an intellectual assent of knowing more and trying to see all the information, or even just seeing a great sign and saying, oh, that was amazing. We believe this person can do it. But it's putting our life on the line and actually getting into Jesus' wheelbarrow when he said, hey, will you let me push you? So we're going to come to a text today in John chapter 4, and we're looking at just this process, right? A process of faith. As faith, is it formed just by what we see? Or is faith really formed by trusting the words of what Jesus is saying? Just to give you a little context as we get up to this, we see this is still pretty early on in Jesus' ministry. We see in John chapter 2 and verse 11 where Jesus does his first miracle, where he turns water into wine. We see verse 11 says what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory. And his disciples believed him. So because of what they saw, what they witnessed, the sign that revealed his glory, his disciples believed him. A little bit later, we see that Jesus goes down to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And then in verse 23 of chapter 2, he says, now while he, being Jesus, while Jesus was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. So again, here's Jesus performing miracles, maybe healing people, maybe driving out demons and people, and doing these great signs, teaching with this great authority, and people see it, and they're like, oh yeah, we're going to believe in this man. And then we see a shift in John chapter 4. In verse 41, you might be familiar with the first part of John chapter 4. It's Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well. And he has this conversation with her, and she just realizes that Jesus is the Messiah that they've been waiting for. And she goes and tells the whole town about this conversation, this man, this prophet, this Messiah that has come in to this village. And they start believing. But then in verse 41 of John chapter 4, we see this phrase that John writes, and it says, and because of his words, many more became believers. So you see this shift that's no longer just people seeing these signs and these wonders that Jesus is doing, but they hear his words and they take his words based upon their faith and become believers in him. So in the last part of chapter 4, we're going to look at today, John, who's the author of this gospel, is going to tell us of a man who has an encounter with Jesus, and in this encounter, this man's going to have to decide something. He's going to have to decide what kind of faith he'll have. Is he going to have a faith that is just dependent on the signs and wonders of Jesus? Or is he going to have a faith that's rooted in Jesus' words? Is he going to be able to really believe in Jesus without seeing him do something? So in John chapter 4, verse 43, it just starts out pretty simply. After the 2 days, he left for Galilee. So Jesus and his disciples, they're returning from Judea, from celebrating the Passover, from Jerusalem. And they stop in Samaria along the way, as I mentioned, where Jesus had this encounter. And it even says earlier in chapter 4 that Jesus spent 2 days with these Samaritan people to continue to teach them and continue to witness to them and perform these miracles around them. And after these 2 days, they leave for Galilee. And then we get this next statement in the next verse, which is kind of odd. It's usually in parentheses, but it's a reference to what Jesus has said before. And in verse 44, it says, now Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. So this verse is tied to the previous story. All this journey of going from Cana to Jerusalem, Jerusalem to Samaria, Samaria back to Galilee. And he's just saying, look, a prophet has no honor in his own country. But it's not, we see other instances of this. We know that Jesus' hometown is Nazareth, but here we see that it seems like he's going back to Galilee, but it's really this reference of particularly looking towards Jerusalem. Right? It's this idea that a prophet doesn't receive honor in his own place, amongst his own people. Right? It would be like if Jesus spent some time in Washington, D.C. celebrating a holiday, and yet he didn't receive any honor there amongst his people, and amongst our leaders there. And so he's like, well, I'm going to go back to Missouri and just hang out there. Maybe they'll show me some honor. So Jesus makes this reference. Hey, a prophet has no honor in his own country. But in verse 45, we see that when he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him. They had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the Passover festival. Again, you see that idea of they've seen everything that he did. Some of them were there. Some of them were at this Passover festival. And they saw him do these works and these signs and these wonders and these miracles. And man, they got back to Galilee before him because obviously he took this little stopover in Samaria, in this Samaritan village. And they're just going around their whole town. Man, you can't believe what we saw at Passover. Man, you won't believe what this guy Jesus did. All this awesome, amazing things. And so the Galileans are like, yeah, come to our place. Come check out what we're doing. We have sickness here too. We could do some healing. We need some miracles in our life as well. So he's welcomed. But he's not welcomed necessarily based on who he is, but just based upon what he can do. And so we see that as we continue in verse 46, it says, once more he visited Cana. Again, this is the original spot of his first miracle of turning water into wine. Once more he visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned water into wine. So he returns there, right? The first place. They could have probably expected something amazing was going to happen. We see that one of these people that are there, it's a father. And it's a father who made a journey and who's in desperate need of Jesus. At the end of verse 46, it says, and there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. And in verse 47, it says, when this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. So you have this certain royal official, and literally is translated the king's man. He was one of the officials probably to King Herod. He was from Capernaum, which is about 15 to 20 miles away from Cana, which would have been a 16 roughly hour journey there and back. Which doesn't seem like that long, right? 15 to 20 miles, we can get there in no time. But as he's walking, he's footing it to Jesus. It's going to take him a while. He put some effort into getting to Jesus. He's heard about maybe what he's done. Maybe he heard about the events Passover. Now, he probably wasn't at the Passover festival because, for one thing, being a member of this royal court of King Herod and his people were not known for their piety in observing the festivals. Secondly, his son's dying. I think he's probably helplessly at his son's bedside, just hoping he gets better, doing everything that he can to bring healing to his boy's sickness. But he just sat there and watched it go from bad to worse. And so at this time, the fever is taken over his son, and death is knocking at the door. And he's like, I have to do something for my son. And we see that faith is often sought in times of desperation. I mean, think about it in your lives. Think about the times where you've experienced severe suffering or desperation in your life, and you've been driven to faith. Even as I've gotten to know some of y'all, I've just heard your story of how God has worked in your life and how God has said, you've told me about, man, I just experienced this time in my life. I didn't know where else to go, and it really grew my faith. I can tell you stories in my life where I've just grown in my suffering or in my desperation because I've had to lean on God more than anything else I could think of. And the same is true for this man. His son is dying. He travels to Jesus. It's urgent. It's emotional. He's pleading for his son's life. He's like, I've got to know if Jesus can do this. I have to know if the stories are true, if the signs that he's doing have actually happened. And he says, I believe they are. But we see that this man's faith it's continuing to develop. See, it's in this moment of this circle, this inner circle. We see that this inner circle, he's in this idea of desperate faith. That's where the inner circle starts. And for a lot of us, that's where faith starts. And that's a perfectly great place for faith to start. I mean, he's begging Jesus, come and heal. He's asking based upon a faith that needs to see still, right? Come to him. Let me see you do it. In my desperation, heal my son. But in order for you to do that, I need you to be physically present. I need to see visible action. I need the immediate proof. And even though our faith might start in desperation, if our faith stays there, it will always look for a sign from God. We always think, well, God, if you just fix this situation in my life, then I'll continue to believe you. But I have to see it done. Or, God, once I see a miracle in my life, well, then I'll continue to trust you. But until then, I just don't know if I can fully get on board. Or God, maybe if you say, hey, God, if it happens like this, if you fix this situation or you heal this relationship in my life or you allow this, whatever is ailing me to go away, if you do it this way, then I'll follow in obedience. And in times of desperation, in times of needing to see Jesus move, in the times where we're asking for a miracle, we have to know this. The problem is not that we want a miracle, right? We should pray for miracles. We should ask God to move. We should ask to see the signs and the wonders that God can perform and how he can intervene in our lives. But if our faith only depends on what we see God visibly do, well, we have to be honest and ask ourselves if we want the miracle more than we want the one who speaks it. You see, a faith that depends on what it sees will always struggle to trust what it can't. A faith that depends on what it sees will always struggle to trust what it can't. So how does Jesus respond to this man? And lean in, because I think this man, he comes desperate for his son's healing, but Jesus is after, not just after a miracle, he's after this man's faith, right? He's not going to let this encounter end until this man's faith is deeper than when it started. And that's so true for our lives when we go through times of suffering or we go through times of desperation and seeking Jesus in our lives, and we say, man, God, what are you doing? And we see that really he's forming our faith. He's bringing our faith deeper and deeper with each thing we encounter. So at first, Jesus responds by saying something that seems like he's not really going to help. And while he's talking to this man, he uses this word you. But we have to understand that this you is not just like singular towards this man. It is the plural form of you. He's addressing the whole crowd at this time around him, asking him to perform these signs and wonders. And in verse 48 it says, unless you people see signs and wonders, Jesus told him, you will never believe. Now here's my favorite part about the plural you in the Greek. The best way to translate it is y'all. It is. So really Jesus is saying, hey, unless y'all people see signs and wonders, Jesus told him, y'all will never believe. Just proves y'all is the greatest southern contraction ever made. But here's what he's saying. He's not just addressing this man. He's not just rebuking this man gently, right? He's saying, hey, all of you, you've seen the signs and wonders I've done. You've seen it happen. You've seen all of it. But if you continue to just see signs and wonders, you'll never really believe. If that's what you're wanting, then you're wanting them more than you actually want me. You're just trying to use me for these transactional purposes. And it might seem that Jesus is speaking this gentle rebuke, but he's intentionally doing this to help this man form his faith more deeply. And in verse 49, it says that the royal official said, well, sir, come down before my child dies. Right? This man, he doesn't try to refute what Jesus is saying. He doesn't try to say, well, Jesus, I'm not the one looking for that stuff. I just need my son healed. But he just says, Jesus, come, please come down before my child dies. He just doubles down on his request. And then Jesus does what this man wasn't expecting, right? This guy, he's hoping that he can convince Jesus to make this 15 to 20 mile trip back to Capernaum to heal his son. But in verse 50, Jesus just says, go. Jesus replied, your son will live. No explanation, no movement, just one command and one promise. Go, your son will live. And the rest of verse 50 tells us how this man responded. It says, the man took Jesus at his word and departed. And I believe it's at this moment that this man's faith was deepened. Right? He came to Jesus in desperation. His faith was starting to form. Like, hey, I believe that he can do these things. I believe he has the ability. I've heard the stories. But at this moment, he moves to this second circle. He trusts the word of Jesus. And we see that he believes before he receives. right? There had to be some tension, right? This man departed and headed back on this 15 to 20 mile journey back to his son, who he hopes when he arrives, his son will be alive. But he walks home with no evidence. He walks home with no visible confirmation. He walks home without seeing any miracle done, but he walks anyway and holds on to what Jesus said. He believes before he receives. And this is hard for us, right? We like to have all the facts before we make a decision, right? We like to see the proof before we trust in something that's reliable. We like to have clarity before we obey what we're being called to. We want everything to make sense before we move in the direction as God is calling us. But if we believe that Jesus is perfect, and we know everything that he does is good for us, that we can trust him, and our faith can grow, and we can trust him before we see, we can obey before it's clear, right? And we can move before it makes sense. You see, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:7, he says that we live by faith and not by sight, right? Which is true. But so many times I think we can use this verse to just promote a blind faith, right? We may live by faith and not by sight, but that doesn't mean our faith is blind, right? Because our faith is based on the words of Jesus. It's based upon not what we see, but on the promises and the hope that we give and what the words that Jesus has given to us. And we live by faith because his word guides us. And we can trust his word. And it's by trusting him in his word we see our faith grow to this second ring, a trusting faith. Right? A trusting faith, a faith that says, hey, Jesus, I'm going to trust you because you say it's true. I'm going to trust you because of who you are. I'm going to trust you because of the relationship that we've been continuing to form, that as I've been deepening my relationship, I can deepen my trust in you as well. You know, if we look back at the great Blondine who does his tightrope walking, two people actually eventually got into the wheelbarrow with him. It was his manager, who'd worked with him for years and years and years, and his nephew. I think now these are separate times, like later in life, but notice it was the people that had a relationship with him, right? They didn't just trust him and believe him based upon the signs that they saw him do, but it's the people that walked life with him. And it's the same in Jesus, right? We can trust him because of what he does and because of what we've seen, but as we continue to develop our relationship with him, we can trust him because of what he says and trust that word will come through. And the story doesn't stop here, though. It doesn't, luckily, right? It doesn't just say the man left and he went home and we don't know what happened, but it continues on. In verse 51, it says, while he, this being the royal official, while he was still on the way, his servants met him with the news that his boy was living. In verse 52, when he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, well, it was yesterday at 1 p.m, the fever left him. In that first half of 53, he said, then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, your son will live. Now maybe your translation says it was the 7th hour. Right? Notice it's the idea of John's even write this idea. The 7's a complete number. It's this complete hour when he realizes this is when Jesus said, my son will live. And now you're reporting to me that my son is alive at that exact time. Can you imagine how this father felt in this moment? Right? Before he even walks into his house, before he even gets close, his servants are running to him saying, hey, your son's alive. He's healed. No proof, no update. He's walking, but then all of a sudden he gets this joyous news. I can only imagine the joy he felt. Right? The relief, the gratitude, the overwhelming realization that his son will survive. But in that moment, right, it wasn't just his son's life that was confirmed, but this man's faith was confirmed as well. Right, did you notice when his faith was confirmed? His faith wasn't confirmed before he left. It's not like Jesus said, hey, let me confirm it. I'll show you a vision and you can see it. His faith wasn't confirmed. It wasn't even when Jesus spoke. But while he was on the way, while he was on the journey, before he arrived, his faith was confirmed. His faith was confirmed after his obedience. And this is how it often works in our lives. We want confirmation before we obey, but God often gives us confirmation through our obedience. We take the step and then we see God move. You trust his word and then you experience the result of it. We see that obedience is often the pathway to confirmation. And I think about that in my life. There's been decisions I've had to make for my family. There's been decisions I've had to make on where I felt God was leading us. And I didn't always have a clear answer. But it wasn't until I said, okay, God, I'm going to obey you. I'm going to be obedient to what you've called us to. And I'm going to take a step. And then as I continued to take those steps, it continued to confirm the faith that I had in God. Saying God, and God was, it's just like God saying, hey, thank you for trusting me. Thank you for being obedient. Maybe it's even in a season of life that I've experienced, maybe you've experienced this as well. Maybe it's just a season that you said, hey, I know there's a next step for my life, but I don't know what that is. And Jesus is saying, well, just continue to be obedient in what I've called you to do now. And as you continue to be obedient in that, I'll continue to reveal what I have in store for you later. But obedience is often the pathway to confirmation. But then comes this ripple. See, the rest of verse 53 is probably one of my favorite sections of this. It says, so he and his whole household believed. His faith grows into a faith, well, that spreads, right? It becomes this third ring of faith, if you will, a transforming faith. A faith that impacts others. It wasn't uncommon in this day and age for if you had somebody over a household that everyone just kind of adopted their faith. And so when it says his whole household, it's not just saying, oh, his wife and his other kids. No, if he had servants, they came and believed. If he had people that were just working for him, they came and believed. It could even be the neighbors that could be considered part of his household. This idea of household is very broad within the New Testament. It could be anybody that has that is dependent upon that house, is dependent upon for their livelihood. That could be the household. And so this man has faith, and he comes in desperation. That's where his faith starts. God continues to grow it, and he says, hey, I'll trust you, God, in your word. I'm going to trust you with my faith. But then that faith continues to go and spread out and transforms not only him, but everyone around him. His whole household believes. Right? It's one man's faith who leads to one son's healing, which leads to one household's salvation. And so what Jesus does is takes the time and says, hey, this miracle is not just going to save your son, but it's going to save your whole household. I mean, it's the story of so many of our families. It's the story of my family. Right? My mom didn't grow up in knowing Jesus. She didn't grow up in a household that believed that he was the Son of God. Pretty dysfunctional household. Right? And at some point in time, she ran away from her home, ended up in Oklahoma, met my dad, and said, hey, this guy's kind of nice. I kind of like him. My dad did. He grew up in a Christian home. He's like, well, if you want to hang out with me on Sundays, you have to come to church with me. She's like, well, he's pretty good looking, so maybe I should go to church. I mean, my life's been a mess up to this point. What could it hurt? She needed some kind of miracle. She needed some kind of trust in her life, and, well, she meets Jesus in this whole process. Right? And because of that process, she said, hey, I don't want my kids to not know who Jesus is. And I'm going to make sure they know who Jesus is. And because she gave that opportunity to us, now me and my sister, we get to pass that down to our families as well, to make sure our kids know who Jesus is. See, it's a faith that continues to transform all the lives around us. It's this ripple effect. Maybe you have that story in your household. Maybe God's continuing to write that story right now in your household. But it allows us to follow him in obedience and to have the faith that he's calling us to have. Essentially, your faith might start with you, but it won't ever stop with you. See, our faith, it affects our home, it affects our relationships, it affects our influence. And as we look at this in second chances, right, and we saw in the first week of this series, we're just reminded that God gives second chances. That he meets us in our brokenness and he calls us forward. Last week we talked about how our second chance, it doesn't erase our past, but it redeems our past. It transforms our story into something that God can use. And today we see that our second chance is never just for us. It's never just for us. So my question, as we kind of wrap things up, is who is on the other side of your obedience? Who is on the other side of your obedience? Who needs to see your faith in action? Who needs to see you take that next step to deepen your faith? Because see, God doesn't want us to stay in this desperate faith. That might be where we come in that first circle, where we come to him and we say, hey, yes, I need something. I need to see some kind of sign or miracle. And that might be what God uses to draw us to him. But we're not meant to stay there. We're meant to continue to grow and move to that trusting faith. To move to that thing where we say, hey, okay, God, I don't know what you have in store. I don't know what you have planned, but I trust you, and I'm going to give my faith to that. And then eventually it continues to ripple out to have that transforming faith, right? That transforms our lives, that transforms the lives of the people around us, that continues to give influence into to our spouse, our parents, our children, our friends, our coworkers. Right? We all can look at someone in our life who's struggling to believe, and they may need to see what it looks like in you first. Someone may not be able to move until you move. Your obedience could be the catalyst they need to have their faith in Jesus. So there's 3 action steps I got for you as we wrap up. First one is this: trust one word. Trust one word. Right? Identify one area of real need in your life and bring it honestly before God this week in order to move from desperation to trust. Maybe there's something in your life. Maybe it's a promise you're struggling to believe. Maybe it's a situation that hasn't changed in your life, but you're just trying to figure out why it hasn't changed. Maybe it's a prayer that you've been praying that hasn't been answered yet. But trust one word. And by one word, what's that one word that God is giving you to trust? To say, hey, I got this. Believe in this promise. Second action step is take one step. One step. To put that trust into action. Right? Maybe it's spending some time in God's word. So working on believing by hearing what you're reading, right? Or not just seeing the miracles and the signs around us. Maybe you need to start something that you've been avoiding, or you need to step into a conversation that needs to be had, or you need to let go of something you've been holding on to. But take one step to move and just trust God that he's guiding you where you need to go. Practical step in this is maybe as you spend time in God's word, just to find one promise or truth from God's word and choose to trust it over whatever circumstance you're going through right now. If you need some help with that, I know I can help you with that. I know several other people would love to help you with that. But maybe it's just finding a promise that you can say, I'm going to make this promise what I trust in this week. The third action step is this: reach one person. Don't keep what God is doing in you for yourself. Who's that one person who's on the other side of your obedience? And it can be as simple as this, right? It can be simple as just living your faith out in front of them. Now, it might mean a spiritual conversation needs to be had. It might mean that you offer to pray with them, or share them about your story or whatever it is. But maybe it's as simple as when something happens at work and everybody's flustered and frustrated, you just say, I'm going to trust God in this process. And you put evident how you're following faith, how you're following God in your faith in that instance. Maybe it's just checking on them spiritually. Maybe it's even a big step. Maybe it's inviting them to study the Bible with you. Say, hey, why don't you just read through the Gospel of John with me? And when they get to chapter 4, you'll know what to say because we just talked about it. It's a great moment to just walk with people. But who's affected by your faith? My challenge this week is be intentional about living it out in front of them. Because our faith is never meant to stop with us. Let me pray for you guys. God, we just thank you for the promises that you give. God, we know that we do come to you in times of desperation. God, and you use those moments in our life to draw us to you and to depend on you. But God, we also know that you love us not to just leave us there, that you'll help us walk through it. God, that you'll build our trust in you. God, and as we trust you and as we rely on you in these circumstances, God, we know that you'll use our faith to transform the people around us. So God, just let us be willing. God, allow us to be open to what you're doing, to be aware of how you're moving. God, and even if we don't know where we're going, even if we don't know what you have planned, God, help us take a step in obedience anyways. So as we follow you, God, we know that you'll use that for your glory so that other people may come to know you. And just praise in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you for joining us today. If you want to learn more about our church, get involved with our ministry, or ask for prayer, visit faith-family.org. We hope you have a wonderful week and look forward to seeing you again soon.